Thank you, Dr. Clark. Thank you, Dr. Clark, and welcome everyone on this lovely day, International Women's Day. Whether you live into old age and succumb to complex health problems, or you get hit by a Mack truck on the way to the mailbox next week, chances are you will one day die in a hospital. The End of Life Care Coalition reported in 2008 that 60% of deaths in Canada still occur in hospitals. Others place this number closer to 70%. And as you lay dying, trying to process the meaning of your life, or your friends and family have heard of the news and arrive at the hospital in a state of shock and bubbling emotion, it might be that a hospital chaplain will be part of that scene. They will help you and your family to navigate through the wilderness adventure of dying in a hospital. Today, I'm going to use the traditional word chaplain rather than the more accurate but longer specialist in spiritual care. Let there be no mistake. Chaplains who work in most urban community hospitals typically have many responsibilities and serve a diverse patient population in a myriad of ways. It's not just about death and dying. My interest is in part personal. Death came to my life experience early. My oldest sister died from childhood leukemia when I was 2 years old, and her death would impact my entire family and its relational dynamics for many years. There were other deaths over the years. Grandmother, aunts, uncles, neighbors, my parents, and some friends have died. I've attended funerals and officiated at memorial services, and always I've been left wondering, what happens at death? Where is the person I knew? Decades later, I decided to fulfill my call to Unitarian Universalist community ministry. While on placement at the Halifax Infirmary as a spiritual care intern, I visited with several patients who later died, and while doing my on-call shifts, I sometimes responded to middle-of-the-night pages that invariably meant someone was near death or had died. These experiences and others confirmed my professional calling to become a certified specialist in spiritual care, and upped my interest in death. The third influence is one I probably share with some of you: my unanswered existential questions about the nature of death and its meaning in relation to life. Is it reasonable to anticipate that there is a mystical or divine presence at death? What happens after that last breath and heartbeat? My own near-death experience many years ago did lower my anxiety about death, though unanswered questions remain. As someone aspiring to work in the hospital setting, I wonder how regular exposure to death and dying impacts the personal and professional lives of chaplains. How does a chaplain's personal experience of death of their loved ones inform their perspective about patient death in the workplace? How does religious and cultural formation figure into this perspective? Is the chaplain's personality type a significant factor in how they react to the death of patients? There's not a lot of extant literature on hospital chaplaincy, much less on this one aspect. There is material on related subjects around the phenomenon, but none specific to the chaplain's understanding of patient death. Canadian researcher Shane Sinclair followed frontline palliative and hospice care professionals, including some spiritual care workers, and he studied the impact of death and dying on the participants' personal and professional lives. His work is close in approach to this study and very meaningful. However, I chose to narrow the focus uniquely to the experiences of chaplains. This study is one of qualitative phenomenology. Its purpose is to describe the experiences of 7 hospital chaplains who have been present with patients at death and the meanings they ascribe to these experiences. I asked broad, general, open-ended questions so that the narrative could flow and reveal a range of interpretations and allow the chaplains to construct meaning themselves in the experiences. So let's turn to the voices of experience. The 7 chaplains I interviewed work in various medical facilities and settings located in large urban centers in both Canada and the United States. 5 are staff chaplains, 2 are denominational chaplains. Today you will hear the reflections of Hope, John, Grace, Joy, Iris, Frank, and Diana. Fictitious names for 7 real men and women who represent over 75 years of combined career experience as hospital chaplains and who have collectively experienced the deaths of thousands of patients. The context where they work include a critical care unit, a level 1 trauma center, tertiary care, palliative care, acute care, and a children's and women's facility. They represent a diversity of religious backgrounds, including the United Church of Canada, Roman Catholic, Unitarian Universalist, Lutheran, and the Anglican Church. In order to maintain their anonymity, I will not associate any of the participants with the geographic location of their workplace. It's probably worth noting that 2 of the chaplains who I interviewed each experienced the death of a parent just days prior to their interview. Both chaplains declined my offer to withdraw from the study, and I believe that this personal experience may have influenced their responses. My intention was to elicit a conversation around the aspects of the experience of patient death which seemed most significant and meaningful for the participants. I asked broad questions and sometimes added supplementary questions once the narrative path had been established. Each interview lasted between 45 and 60 minutes. When I asked, "What is your experience of the death of patients?" the participants responded from perspectives that fell into 3 general categories: role, context, and self in context. Some went immediately to their work history or described their current work setting. Some described the patient demographic they work with. Some spoke to the breadth of death experiences from a more personal observer of self perspective. When asked to tell me about those patient deaths which are most significant for them and to explain how or why these deaths were significant, the 7 chaplains reflected with varying degrees of ease and clarity. The stories were told with a range of emotion. 2 of the participants became tearful in sharing some of the more difficult stories. I believe my data lies behind the actual narratives. Why did each of these chaplains choose the particular situations and people to talk about? What is it about the chaplain that saw them direct their focus to a specific long-held memory? How does their personal experience, their worldview, inform the situations which impress them most? I can report that the memories of many patients who have died remain with them, sometimes after many years. Anecdotally, I find it interesting that 3 chaplains volunteered the fact that they keep obituary notices and photographs of some of their patients in their desk drawer or wallet, years after their deaths. The other chaplains may similarly collect mementos, though they did not volunteer this information and it was not an interview question. The specific role that chaplains play with patients at death was consistently described by all 7 participants with words that set it apart from other aspects of their job. They used words like sacred, special, honor, privilege, gift, and duty. The group had between them thousands of patient death experiences to choose from, and anywhere from 100 to several hundred experiences each. Yet they chose to tell me about a few specific patients. On average, each participant described 3 people or scenarios for a total of 25 stories across the 7 chaplains, and other less specific narratives were also shared. I found characteristics in each of the chaplains' choices which revealed 8 identifiable themes. The patients featured in the narratives often possessed similar characteristics to the chaplains themselves. The patient was the same age, had the same name, or they had similar interests or shared life experience, and so on. This human phenomenological response comes under the heading of transference. In 3 instances, a long or intense pastoral visiting relationship had pre-existed the death of the patient featured in the story. 6 of the chaplains described especially liking the patient or having been deeply impressed by some aspect of their personality. Several narratives fell into the broad categories of notably good death or extremely traumatic death. Another theme was the relational conflict involving the key people in the story, between the patient and family members or significant others, or conflict involving staff, or the role the chaplain played in mediating that conflict. A 6th theme lies in the fact that several stories had a baby, a child, or a particularly vulnerable person at its center. In 7 of the narratives, the spiritual, mystical, mysterious, divine, or inexplicable characteristics figured strongly. Another theme in 5 of the chaplain's stories involved the medical, ethical, and systemic challenges around the particular experience, or the moral interpretations it raised for them. Across the 25 narrative stories describing specific patient deaths, as well as in general observations about death, all 7 chaplains touched on several of these themes just outlined, often overlapping within one single narrative. We will now hear 6 of the group's reflections in vignette form. These will illustrate some of the themes, and in some instances show the chaplain's interpretation of the experience. Diana, who works in a trauma center, told me that she had been called following a baby's death. And another chaplain had responded to the actual death, but Diana was needed to attend to the baby's grandmother.
The baby was born fully developed. Wouldn't have had any reason to die, but just strangled on its umbilical cord. And this baby had been held by its maternal grandmother for about 24 hours. She wouldn't put it down. The baby was still warm, was turning gray, but still warm, and she just couldn't put the baby down. That one sticks with me because it was so difficult to help her let go. And there was so much disappointment and pain in the room by so many people. The baby was so perfect.
Similarly, Grace spoke of being called to an exhausted and grieving mother of a stillborn child who refused to leave the hospital until her dead baby was blessed. Both women spoke of the baby being perfect. Diana repeated this 4 times while telling her story. Grace also revealed that she had previously experienced the loss of her own baby. Hope told me about an experience she had while working as a chaplain at another hospital. Hope went on to say how much sadness this death created and also described how she stayed with the nurses for a couple of hours afterward. They were upset after the traumatic, futile effort to keep the woman alive, and that it had been set in motion because of a poor choice encouraged by a surgeon. This raised questions of an ethical and moral nature for everyone involved. Frank described an experience with the family of an 87-year-old woman as she neared death.
Then she closed her eyes, and there was this pause of 15 seconds or so, and she did her last big breath and gave up her spirit. Now when she gave up her spirit, her two daughters and I felt this energy fill the room, and it made us tingle all over. And I felt this energy moving through me, and I laughed and cried at the same time. I wasn't aware that it was a different sound of laughter. I simply felt this moving through me. It was their mother's laughter, distinctly. And then she was gone. We were all filled with so much wonder and privilege at being there.
Was the chaplain used as a spirit medium in the moment of death? The configuration of people present seems significant. This laughter, seemingly channeled through Frank, would not have been identified or even observed had he been alone with the dying woman. I wonder what relational dynamics existed for the trio. Frank mentioned that the daughters' husbands had stepped out earlier for a break, looking for relief from their anxiety. When they returned, they were disappointed to hear that they had missed something so remarkable.
People dying seem to have an amazing ability, even unconscious, of orchestrating exactly where people are, or waiting in the moment.
Grace recounted a time when she was asked by a family to sit in an operating room with a child whose organs were being harvested for donation. She described sitting uncomfortably on a stool, feeling out of place amongst the surgeons. Their casual banter, the way they ignored her, even suggesting some displeasure or disapproval at her presence, raised Grace's discomfort. She describes it as disappointing in that the child was being kept alive only long enough to take her organs. Grace thought of those last moments as sacred. She also said it was conflicted because this girl's organs were going to some of her other patients, thus a positive side in contrast with the young girl's tragic death. Iris indicated that she is really taken by the fragility of life and the mysterious point of transition from being to non-being. Her repetitive language and tone during the interview suggested incredulity around this phenomenon. Iris told me about being called to go view an autopsy as part of her student chaplain training. She said she felt shock and incomprehension upon arriving in the autopsy room to discover that the body in pieces on the table was that of a woman who Iris knew. Days earlier, she had been with that woman who attended the worship service which Iris regularly led for the veterans of the long-term care facility where she trained. I turned my attention to the impact death experiences has had on the participants. Some of the quotations you're about to hear are composite. Most of the chaplains were expansive in answering my broad questions, thus they often offered material in one response that speaks directly to different questions. Lots of overlap. I asked how they experienced the deaths over the long term.
If you always take people home, you will never be able to be long-term in the position. You have to have your life separated out. But if you never take anybody home, then you're also probably inappropriate for the caring position. They all help me to prepare for my own death. Help me be appreciative of my life, aware and grateful. They don't fundamentally change who I am.
Throughout the interviews, it became evident that this group of chaplains represents individuals who, while not fully integrating every experience of death, have developed an awareness of the value and fragility of life, and a fluid and evolving theology and philosophy of death and life, which grows more sophisticated over the course of their years of experience with death. Their experiences does not seem necessarily to remove fear of dying or even of death. However, the knowledge gleaned through experience allows a certain steadiness in life and acceptance of death. When I asked about their theology of death, each participant initially struggled with the question. Finding words seemed difficult, and it took a while. 3 chaplains used either humor or sarcasm to couch what may have been initial discomfort or resistance in regard to this question. The clear emergent theme was process, seen in the reshaping of their understanding of God, of what comes after death, and in the evolution of their theology of death itself. Death, life seemingly inseparable. 6 of the chaplains responded in terms of theology of life and used images of continuum, circles, or of continuing education. 4 spoke of of birth in explaining it. 1 referenced the Celtic notions of thin places. 3 of the Christian chaplains specifically spoke about what death is not, and observed that they had come to reject some doctrinal orthodox views of death. The Unitarian Universalists were unanimously committed to observing that death is essentially unknowable and that they are okay with that. Anecdotally, 2 chaplains also spoke in terms of being born to nurture. Diana said this of her personal experiences of death in her own life as preparation for her ministry. I have been born into people dying around me my whole life. I have the gift of losing people. Let's hear their words.
I have no answers, and that irritates some people. My plan is living as though there may be nothing else on the other side, and to leave the world better than I found it, though I would be kind of pissed off if it happened right now. I don't want to be in the position where I'm not talking to my sister, where there are those relational gaps. It's really about life. What's more important is what happens in the middle. Birth and death are just the bookends.
I think when you die, you step out of our sense of time. Heaven is going to be a continued school, learning how to love and how to be in relationship. We are left continuing in perfect love, but we're not complete. Like a circle, 360 degrees of perfect love is our goal. Death is a natural part of our existence. After death is no concern of mine, improvable in any case.
Again, the themes around theology of death. I was curious how anyone who is regularly steeped in an environment where fellow humans are experiencing pain, suffering, anxiety, fear, death, and grief managed to keep on an even keel. I asked what practices helped them to integrate their experiences of death. Turns out they engage in diverse and unique activities. One chaplain practices meditation. Another is satisfied with the reflective process. One woman sings. Another spoke of intentionally embracing life's joys, having fun. Another writes vampire stories, because vampires never die. One chaplain does logosynthesis, a practice where a word-mind connection is the central feature. Several spoke of engaging in prayer and liturgy. One chaplain holds up the memories of all her patients who have died within a certain time period at subsequent memorial services. One chaplain meets with colleagues in a group that was formed in response to an especially difficult week at the trauma center where she works. She says of it, "We had a murder-suicide, the attempted murder of a patient on the hospital unit, a teen involved in a traumatic car accident, and a member of the nursing staff being violently murdered in a domestic scene." I think if I had a week like that, I'd want to be part of a support group myself. 2 chaplains recalled gratefully how their mentors continued to influence their careers. 1 chaplain does photography to express himself, and 3 chaplains use some ritual or other, including visualization and hand washing. When asked what makes integrating experiences of death difficult, the responses fell into 2 broad categories: external and internal elements. The internal elements include emotional resistance, self-doubt, complacency in self-care practices, coming to terms with the suffering of others, inadequate debriefing of experiences, and as one chaplain puts it, the natural tendency to want to sit in the basement and watch cable TV. The external elements include when concerns in the chaplain's personal life overtake their professional role, or when ethical challenges arrive, such as the whole issue of do not resuscitate orders. Now, medical staff must respond when a DNR is not in place or is overridden by the family, despite that the patient's survivability is nil, and such action is sometimes perceived as invasive, futile, excessive, not to mention a drain on the healthcare system. Another external is work pressure that comes from having too many patients for too few chaplains, sometimes double the ratio of the professional standard. Some talked about having to triage patients as a result and leaving work knowing that there are patients left unseen. Can't be easy. In the grand scheme of their work, spiritual care is a discipline apart, with services that have been traditionally perceived as immeasurable. How can pastoral interventions be measurable? And how can they be demonstrated as cost-effective? How can their cost-effective benefits to patients be demonstrated over time, as other disciplines would, medical disciplines would establish? After listening carefully to the 7 career chaplains tell me their stories and poring over their words again and again, here's what I concluded. First, my definition of a healthy chaplain. Healthy chaplains are those who find outlets for self-expression. They establish networks for debriefing difficult experiences, develop a theology or philosophy for life and death. They understand the critical importance of separation and boundaries between their professional and personal lives, and are able to forgive themselves in their human struggle to maintain separation of these. Here's what I also concluded. Chaplains in contemporary healthcare settings share a dedication and compassion which helps them transcend the challenges they face. They recognize the unique quality of their role in being with patients at death and of supporting families and loved ones at this time. Death and the relational conflict that sometimes surrounds it leads chaplains to ascribe priority to living lives intentionally, fully, and meaningfully. Experiences of death are integrated proportionally to the personal connectedness or perceived connectedness to the dying patient and the degree of trauma or conflict involved with the death. Fear of death is decreased for some chaplains over time. Fear of dying is not necessarily decreased. A chaplain's faith in God, their acceptance of spirit and energy as forces in the world, or their trust in the human capacity to lead meaningful lives without any concrete answers, helps to sustain them and to make sense of their experiences of death and of life. In spite of exposure to countless scenes of trauma and suffering, chaplains stay in the game. They persist in helping people navigate through their wilderness, through their anxiety and grief. They stand in wonder at the beauty of a good death. They vow to live well and meaningfully. And they remember. So now I ask that you take a couple of minutes to reflect and consider your questions or comments as we listen to a song that was sung to me by one of the chaplains during our interview. It was inspired by a passage in the book of Isaiah. She uses it to evoke an emotional response in parents who have lost babies when they are particularly numb. Today it is sung by my friend Deborah Wiggins.
Does a mother forget her baby? Or a woman, a child within her womb? Yet even if these forget, yes, even if these forget, I will never forget my own. I will never forget you, my people. I have called you on the palm of my hand. I will never forget you. I will not leave you orphaned. I will never forget my own.
Thank you for your attention. I know it's been long, but thank you.
We have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes.
Thank you, Helen. You mentioned in your conclusions that the chaplains that you spoke to recognized the importance of their role. I'm wondering if they indicated to you any disconnect with the others in the healthcare field who did not recognize that importance, and if they felt that they had to be an advocate for their own positions and for expanding the spiritual care departments of their facilities.
Well, certainly, I think it was reflected that there is oftentimes an incongruence of philosophy and perspective. The role of spiritual care providers in hospital is quite different from the whole medical philosophy, which is geared towards life and of cost-effective, quick turnarounds and so forth. And oftentimes, I mean, because staff represents a whole spectrum of belief and religious and non-religious identities themselves, there is, as was the case when in case of the chaplain who was in the operating theater with the surgeons, she really expressed that she had felt great tension, that she was not wanted there. And so there is sometimes, I believe, some conflict, though I believe that the role, one of the great opportunities for spiritual care providers in hospitals is to build bridges. I mean, I found that oftentimes my work as a spiritual care intern was not just with patients. I work with staff too. It's a whole, interrelational thing, because they too are part of that experience. So the problem, I think, there are not always visible chaplains. They're not all, there are so few. There are staff chaplains, denominational chaplains, but there's so few that they're not always visible in every unit. So when a unit gets used to the idea that there's a chaplain there, and they begin to understand the kind of breadth of work and service that is provided, then the relationship gets much better. The reasons there aren't, I believe, well, there are a number of reasons why there aren't enough chaplains, and obviously dollars are a huge thing, and again, that problem of how do you qualify or our interventions as chaplains? How do you qualify what, spending an hour with a patient? How do you go back and say a month later and say, how was that for you? It's a very hard discipline to evaluate, and we also don't have, I don't believe, a good history of researching what we do, or necessarily tracking what we do. Getting better at this. People are starting to write about chaplaincy in many regards, and I'm hoping to pursue that myself as well. I don't know if that answers your questions, but thanks.
Rob?
Helen, thanks. That was awesome. Wondering about this. I can only imagine that sometimes chaplains are called in for very acute situations, so they have a very brief amount of time with a patient or with a patient's family. Mm-hmm. Was there any sense that I'm trying to think in the longer term, did they get a sense that they provided some longer term help in that very brief moment for the survivors who've been through this? Do you get any sense of that?
I think some of the participants did reflect that they could leave a situation and be able to estimate that they had had some impact, that their anxiety or their emotions were relieved somewhat, but oftentimes that's not the case. You don't really know what impact. But the interesting thing, and again, this whole memento, the thing of mementos and of obituaries and so forth, or oftentimes it's down the road that they'll just sort of accidentally discover, they'll meet a family member who will say, it meant so much to me that you were there that night. And they have, no clue what impact they had that night, right? Because you go into a situation of chaos, family members are upset. I remember I was called one night to a woman who had a brain aneurysm, and family, not religious, but I was called by staff, and oftentimes it's the staff calling who are the ones, they're the ones who make the call based on their idea of what is needed, right? Not necessarily family. So I was called, and I went into this tiny little family room which was filled with family members waiting with the woman was on. They were waiting to harvest her organs. They were keeping her alive to harvest her organs, but they're waiting for her brain to cease activity fully to do that. So the whole conflict was around, well, when is she going to die? When is death? Is it when the brain stops? Is it when? But if you're going to harvest organs, you need to keep the body alive to do that. And the shock. I mean, this woman had been walking, talking, like this whole being, non-being. She was fine 1 minute, and boom, life falls apart for her and for her entire family. And I was with that family most of that night, and coming and going, because you have to leave space too. And I remember I came back later. I gone back sometime around 4 a.m. or something, and to check in with one of the sons, and they'd had time to process some stuff, and were able. They needed to let go, just let go. So I was just holding this sobbing young man who had just losing his mom, and he was very, it was clear to me that in just a couple of words that he expressed, this means so much to me. And whether or not they remember that right away, or they process that as, oh, that chaplain was so helpful, or if it just, as a memory triggered later on when maybe they see me again. I've had people come up on the street and say, hey, and they have to find me because I can't see them, right? Wow, what a that was, how are you? You know, and they're giving me updates, and these are patients I haven't seen from like rehab center or from years ago. So, they do have memories, but the problem is that we can't really demonstrate it, and that's the whole issue of we're not a medical discipline. We don't work in that scientific model of that evaluative process the same way, and that's the incongruity.
I'm afraid we're just going to have to stop. We won't have time for any more questions. Boy, oh boy, in the last two and a half or day and a half, we've been able to touch on so many immeasurables that have made a difference in people's lives. I think Helen today took a chance and took an opportunity to explore one particular immeasurable that has huge consequence and huge impact in people's lives. And you did it very graciously. Helen, thank you so much.
Thank you.